Welcome, psychologists. I'm your professor, Brian Keith. Welcome back to class and to something a little bit different. This is the first in what I'm calling our single slide series. In my single slide series, I pick out a single slide from the week's lecture that I would normally give to an in person class, and I serve it up to you bite sized style so that instead of a full week's worth of lectures, you get one of my favorite pieces of information served up so you can focus just on that. Now, of course, since this is taken directly from class, you probably want to treat it just like you would class information. So go ahead and take a second to pause, break out a sheet of paper and a pen or pencil or your computer, whatever it is you use to take notes on. And in the meantime, I'll get us switched over to our slide so that I can talk to you a little bit about one of my favorite topics in social psychology. And welcome here to one of my favorite slides. This is one of my favorite slides for a number of reasons. For one, it demonstrates one of my favorite words in the German language, Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is that sense of taking pleasure at the misfortune of others. If you've ever watched America's Funniest Home Videos, or I think AFV is what it's called now, or you've watched people make fools of themselves on Twitter or Vine or Instagram or TikTok, you're familiar with this sense of Schadenfreude. I also like this because it demonstrates one of my favorite principles in all of social psychology, the overconfidence bias. The overconfidence bias is something that we all fall prey to, not just this gentleman here. Social psychologists have known about it for decades, and regularly, if you ask people how good they think they are at something, we tend to overestimate our abilities. We're overconfident in how good we are at stuff. This holds true for all sorts of skills and people across all walks of life. If you were to ask all of us how good we think we are at writing, at math, at driving, at gardening, even at our ability to just generally do well at school or communicate with other people, we tend to be more confident in our abilities. We estimate that we're a lot better than we actually are. This overconfidence bias can be seen in a lot of places. One of my favorite examples of the overconfidence bias is the planning fallacy. I fall prey to this all the time. The planning fallacy means that we tend to imagine that when we're going to engage in a task, that it's going to take a lot less time than it actually does. With me, I think about how much time I imagine it would take to spread some mulch. I say it'll take 10 or 15 minutes, and 2.5 days later, I'm still not done with the project. But we're also familiar with this whenever we imagine how long it takes to complete an assignment or study something. We imagine that we've blocked out enough time right before the due date, and then that due date or due time rolls around and we're nowhere near done. This all comes back to the fact that we're overconfident in our abilities and imagine it's going to take a lot less time than it actually does. We'll talk in a second about the machinery, the mental machinery behind how this happens, but first I want to talk about some other names for the overconfidence bias and other specific examples of how it works. The overconfidence bias isn't just known as the overconfidence bias, it's also sometimes known as the better than average effect, because we all imagine that we're better than average. We imagine not only that we're better than we actually are, but compared to our peers, we're better than most people are. We can be highly critical of ourselves, but a lot of times we imagine deep down when we get down to the core that if I were to look at how good of a writer I am, I know I'm no Ernest Hemingway, but I'm pretty good, right? How good am I at mathematics? Well, I never am better than a C, but that was my professor. Those were my peers. Math is just real hard. In the end, I'm pretty dang good. We all imagine that we're better than average drivers, even if our record doesn't seem to reflect that. The better than average effect also has a pretty similar name, illusory superiority. You got to peek at it just a second ago because even though I'm better than average at computers, I tend to jump ahead on my slides, right? Illusory superiority means just what you imagine it might, that we imagine we're superior, but in the end, it's really an illusion. One of my favorite examples, though, of illusory superiority, the better than average effect, or the overconfidence bias is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Named after the two researchers who first identified it in a paper, I really like the title of this one, Unskilled and Unaware of It. Dunning and Kruger examined something really interesting about the overconfidence bias. Looking at people and a number of tasks, academic ability, mathematic ability, even athletic ability, Dunning and Kruger found that people not only overestimated their abilities, but that these overestimations were related to how good they actually were at tasks. Specifically, what Dunning and Kruger found is that the worse you are at something, the better we tend to believe that we are. Dunning and Kruger found, in other words, the people who were relatively good at a skill, they were able to evaluate that they were pretty good at it. But that the worse we were at it, the less experience we had, the less skilled we were at something, the better in the end we thought we were. This helps explain why so often I imagine, that I haven't played basketball since what I was in middle school gym class, but if I were to get there on the court today, I think I'd probably do all right. Uh, I'm horrible in the kitchen. I definitely can't bake anything, but I could probably follow the instructions on a box of cake to make something that not only tasted great, but looked better than those pictures you see on Instagram or Reddit. So, why is it that the Dunning Kruger effect happens, that we overestimate our abilities to such great lengths when we're unskilled at something? Well, there are a couple reasons for this. One of the reasons ties into a couple of biases that are introduced to you in your textbook, but also in that comic by the oatmeal. And this underlies all of the overconfidence bias. And the first is that we all fall prey, again, all the time, to confirmation bias and belief persistence. If I already think that I'm pretty good at stuff, and let's be honest, who doesn't think they're pretty good at just about everything? If I already believe I'm pretty good at stuff, I'm going to fall prey to confirmation bias. And in the end, I'm going to remember the times that I'm successful at something, right? So if I imagine that generally speaking, I'm in pretty good shape, I'm pretty good at athletic stuff, even though I almost never do it, I'm going to think back to times that I've been successful, right? The one time that I accidentally sunk a 3-pointer in gym class, or that I won a game of horse against my dad that I'm sure he definitely didn't throw, right? When I think about baking, I'll remember that one time that I was successful making a cake, kind of, in the sense that it was edible, and I'll entirely forget and block out those times that I failed, like the 3 times I failed baking the cake before. I had to run back to the store, I think, 4 times to get replacement boxes so I could make it all right one time. In addition, we fall prey to belief persistence. And if you remember from the comic from the oatmeal, as well as your introductory chapter, belief persistence means that when we hold a belief already, especially one of really great personal importance, like I'm a valuable person who's good at stuff, we tend to stick to our beliefs even when we run into evidence that we're wrong. This is why, like, you can be around friends who are bragging about how good they are at stuff, that they get excellent grades, that they win debates, that they're the ones who always win arguments or drive the best, or are fantastic at managing money. And when you point out, helpfully, to help them see things accurately, that they get in accidents all the time, that they're the ones always asking for money to help cover the bills, that they couldn't cook their way out of a wet paper bag, they, rather than saying like, oh yeah, you're right, you can think of 6 failures to every one of the successes I can think of, they stick to their guns. And as the oatmeal pointed out with the backfire effect, not only do we tend to stick to our guns when our views are threatened, but we stick to our guns even more strongly than we did before they were threatened in the first place. So that's one explanation for why belief persistence and confirmation bias. The second reason ties into why we fall prey to stereotypes. Just like we explained in the video earlier, one of the reasons that stereotypes happen is that they emerge out of the most salient examples from a population, the most attention-getting examples. So if we think about it this way, like let's take something that any of us could be really bad at, something like a really challenging class at school. For me, it might be math or biology. For you, it might be a writing class. If I go into class every single day, and every single day I go in, I really struggle to do well on an assignment. No matter what I do, I just can't push through this math stuff. That might be a really frustrating experience in the moment, but what it means is that any given failure that I have in this class isn't really going to jump out at me. It's going to be like any other experience. The stuff that's going to be really attention getting, that's going to be really salient, are those times that every now and then, once in a blue moon, I have a success. But counterintuitively, because that stuff almost never happens and it's so attention getting, that's what I'm going to use to establish my beliefs, not just about stereotypes, but about myself too. So that when I run back through my mental filing cabinet trying to create an idea of how good I am at something, I'm not going to think about failure after failure after failure. I'm going to think about the 1 or 2 times where I've been successful, even though, not just even though, but exactly because they're flukes. So why is it that we continue to perceive things inaccurately? Well, we stick to our guns because we don't like being threatened. We establish these beliefs because, in a way, they're not represented, but also because we see that the overconfidence bias, the better than average effect, illusory superiority, even the Dunning-Kruger effect, these are all part of something that we think of as a psychological immune system. And this is supported by the existence of something known as depressive realism. what we tend to find is that these ideas about believing we're better than we actually are, these problematic schemas and the resulting construals, these hold for just about everybody, except for people who are a little bit depressed. Now, when we talk about being depressed, I don't just mean being sad. I mean more like clinical levels of depression where you lack motivation and lack energy and generally feel bad about yourself. When this is so bad you can't function on an everyday basis, this is tied in with what we call a mood disorder, like major depressive disorder. But many people go through stages in their lives where it's not so bad it affects them on an everyday basis, but you're also not feeling your best. This is that kind of subclinical depression where you're feeling down and don't feel great about yourselves. People who suffer from this kind of subclinical depression, we find, have much more realistic evaluations of themselves. They're a lot better at evaluating how good they actually are at stuff. And one of the things this shows is how problematic the truth can be. After all, if I really see myself as I am, I see my failures as strongly as I see my successes, well, I'm probably going to fail a lot. And I'm probably going to see those failures a lot. And in the end, that's going to make me feel pretty bad about myself. If on the flip side, I've got a healthy psychological immune system, I don't see those failures. I ignore those times where I haven't been successful. And instead, I only see the times where I've been great at stuff. Why I'm going to feel pretty good about myself. And I'm also going to be a lot more likely to engage in risky, well, semi risky behavior, take risks that maybe result in me being successful. If I end up being successful, I continue to feel great. And if I end up not being successful, well, maybe I'm not going to take too much away from that. In this way, what we see is that it's possible that this kind of problematic or inaccurate thought actually maybe isn't problematic at all. That it's just part of being able to survive and be mentally healthy in a world that maybe punishes us a lot more often than it rewards us. So that was it. One of my favorite concepts from social cognition is overconfidence bias, but especially that Dunning-Kruger effect. Keep your eye out for more single slide discussions as well as more short videos related to social cognition. I know there's a lot of difficult material, but especially if you take a look at that video on schemas and construals and practice coming up with your own schemas and construals as well as fighting back against them, I think you'll really have this solid. As always, if you have questions for me, don't feel too worried about reaching out to me during office hours. I'm always excited to talk to you guys. Feel free to send me messages in Canvas, give me phone calls, or video chat. Drop me a line. Thanks for all your hard work this semester. I'm looking forward to working with you even more.